Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first session of the year of the Spotfire Quarterly Connect Community Series. My name is Chris Stump, and I'm a Marketing Program Manager and Spotfire Product Marketing Manager for
Revity Signals.
And I will be your moderator for this session. We have a fantastic webinar for you today, but before I introduce today's speakers, I want to share why I think you may find this webinar helpful. So why would you want to learn more about the capabilities of Spotfire? First, with the Spotfire Basics webinar that you're about to see, we want to help you join the ranks of the analytics revolution by giving you an introduction to Spotfire, a powerful and easy to use platform with a low barrier to entry. And secondly,
Revity Signals
products are powered by Spotfire. So knowing more about Spotfire will help you get more out of Signals Vitro Vivo, Signals Inventa, and Lead Discovery Premium. And for our webinar today, we're going to provide you with an introduction to Spotfire Basics. Specifically, we're going to cover the four main capabilities of Spotfire: data access, data preparation, data exploration and visualization, collaboration, and sharing. Then we'll provide a few tips and tricks that we think you'll find useful. Our presenters today are Danis Martinez, Andrew Karakovic, and Bob Moore. Danis and Andrew are both field application scientists with lots of experience helping our customers solve scientific and analytics challenges. And Bob Moore is our head of customer experience. Prior to
Revity Signals,
he worked at TIBCO for close to a decade. Bob is passionate about all things Spotfire and has logged well over 10,000 hours in the seat with Spotfire. And before turning the session over to Bob to start us off, I have just one quick housekeeping reminder before we start. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be shared with all attendees in the next couple of days. So without further ado, I turn the floor over to you, Bob.
Excellent, Chris. Thank you very much. Appreciate it and very happy to be here. So as you see on the screen, the goals for this session, what do we want to do? Well, right now we just want to start off and introduce Spotfire. As Chris said, we're going to focus on the basics of Spotfire, give you a nice introduction. But anytime anybody takes on something new and takes on a new challenge, it takes time. So I want to spend some time in this session through my colleagues accelerating that journey, giving you a few tips and a few insights from somebody who has spent about 15 years with the tool to accelerate that journey, to get you further down the path quicker. And one way I continue to do that is stress the fundamentals. Not only am I going to say that for you folks, but I continue after all these years to use the elements, the fundamental elements of Spotfire day in and day out. And I guess the most important thing I want to do in this session is create some excitement around Spotfire. It's an incredible tool. It's a great tool for a scientist. It's a great tool for a business analyst, for leadership, for managers. It is very versatile and can be used in many, many different ways. And I hope that many of you walk away from this session saying, I want to know more about Spotfire, and we have some information about that as well. But with that thought of investing your time, why should we ask you for that time and make that investment? Well, there are a few reasons. One is it promotes a high level of engagement with the data, engagement with the process of analyzing the data. Many of you probably work in a lab and you're making things all day and putting things into beakers and into instruments. Well, you're engaged in the process. Well, with Spotfire, you can be engaged with the data and the analytics process as well. Fosters collaboration among the team. Danis has a nice little section towards the end of his presentation, how you can do the engagement, but then once you have that, share that collaboration or collaborate rather with the teams. Overcome obstacles and barriers. Things are going to come up. There's going to be problems with data. There's going to be a different way of looking at it. A last-minute request may come in. Spotfire allows you to overcome those obstacles. It's going to lead to faster insights. You'll be able to take your scientific data, your business data, look at it, and maybe there's something that you want to follow and drill down on, or maybe it's a fail-fast scenario where you want to drop it off and not spend any more time. But I guess the most important thing is that it increases the probability of success for all the things above and for other things within your environment. Using Spotfire is going to help you through that process. And then ever so quickly, sort of picking up on what Chris talked about, the fundamental roles of Spotfire, the way I look at it is all things that you do in Spotfire can be put into one of these four buckets: data access and management, data prep and enrichment, data exploration and visualization, sharing and collaboration. So anything that you do, while you might look at the program as new or it might be daunting to you, if you think about putting that in those 4 buckets, it helps you work through those. And then again, in the spirit of time and how to take your time learning Spotfire, the way I like to think about it is accelerate by slowing down. Take your data and take the time that you have allotted and break it into 4 chunks. The first part of it's going to be preparing the data, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And that's a bit of alchemy. It's taking something that it might be lacking and making more of it. Explore the data, play around with it, look at it this way and through this lens and from the top and from the bottom. And then when it comes to visualize, I always like to overbuild. And if I think my process needs 5 charts, I'm going to build 10 or 12. And then in the 4th stage, I'm going to ruthlessly edit those down, refine those. And what was a good idea yesterday needs that critical editor's eye. And Spotfire allows you to do that. And then the last thing before I hand it off to showing you the screen and walking you through the interface very briefly is I strongly suggest is new to the product. You want to spend some time doing your work data, the stuff that you're being expected to do in your job, but also split that time and go off and find some fun data. The internet is absolutely filled with data on nearly every topic. And it really helps to learn the product if you're doing something that you're engaged with from that perspective. So let me stop there. And I'm just going to give you a quick tour of the interface so that you kind of get a sense of what Spotfire is all about. And that's the product that we'll be using throughout the balance of today. And if we look at Spotfire here, this is the thick client interface. And some of you may have questions about, do I need to install it on my desktop or can I use it in the web? The answer is both. Today's session is going to be using the desktop version, but there is also a web-based version here. At the top of the screen, we have a shorthand notation for clicking in and creating new visualizations. Going over here, and we have some things around the filter panel that you'll see here. And this is a really critical aspect of Spotfire. As you bring in data, and Andrew's going to show us how to bring in data in just a minute, all of these filter panels are created for us. No need to program, no need to do any fancy database stuff. The data is brought in, and it's immediately accessible. And then over here, we always have some indicators of what we're doing with the data, how many rows we've marked, how many columns, those kinds of things. And then here, the data canvas allows us access to a number of different features of Spotfire, being adding rows, columns, those kinds of things. We're going to drill into that a little bit from that perspective. And then up at the top, we have some data panel and our full suite of visualizations there. So I want to give you just a quick tour of the interface because that's what you'll be seeing for the balance of this session as well. So with that being said, I'd like to hand it over to Andrew, and he's going to take us through the first phase of that, bringing data into Spotfire, or the data access piece. So Andrew, why don't you take the team through the webinar through that?
Thank you, Bob, for the nice introduction. Welcome, everybody. This first section is all about bringing data into Spotfire. There's many different ways to do this. You can start from previous Spotfire analyses, or you can start from recent data files down in this list. But a common way to bring data in is by browsing for a local file. So once I find my CSV file, I open it up. The first screen that I get is the import wizard. Now, this is great because it allows me to quickly preview my data and make any minor changes if needed. I notice that this column here has years in it, so I can quickly rename it to years, as well as this variable type should be set to string in this case. After I click OK, I get my first Spotfire visualization. Now, in my case, I've set up the default to be a data table because I like how this mimics my starting data. A good practice at this point would be to rename this data page to data and keep it around for future reference. A powerful feature of Spotfire is this data canvas. What this does is track everything that we've done. We've brought in a CSV file, and it enables us to further enrich our data if needed. What I want to do is add a couple of columns to the data I've already brought in, and to do that, I just need to hit this plus and add columns. And then I browse for my other CSV file. I'm looking for region and income information. The import wizard pops up. Everything looks fine here. But now I want to check for the settings for the added columns. I see my original data is on the left and my new data is on the right. And what it's using to match the two data sets is the dark blue in the middle. After clicking OK, the data canvas is updated to reflect the merger of the two data sets. And my preview table on the bottom shows the two new columns on the right. And if I go back to my original data table, I've set up my defaults again to show the new additions here as well. So now we brought in data from one CSV file, added columns to it from another CSV file. But what if we had an Excel file? Again, I'm going to browse for a file, find my Excel file. And the import wizard will pop up here. In a second. Great. Must be my internet. But so this is not the data that I was expecting right here. With Excel, I need to remember to select the correct worksheet. And once I do that, oh yeah, this is what I want to bring in here. And I can do it right here. You can also add data to Spotfire by pasting it right from your clipboard. Or you can connect to an external data source. Another common function in Spotfire is adding rows to your data. Now, I'm starting from 3 data sets, the carbon dioxide emissions from solid, liquid, and gaseous consumption. I've preloaded the first here. And what I want to do is stack all 3. And to do that, all I need to do is go back to my data canvas and add rows, find my emissions from my liquid consumption. And the import wizard, I noticed that the first row here should be a name row, so I can refresh it to reflect the changes. And again, I want to check the settings for my added rows here. So now I see my original data up top and my new data on the bottom. Now, before proceeding, I like to glance over at how many rows and columns I have. Each one of my data sets has the same amount of rows, so this number should double after we bring in this data set. So it's brought in, the data canvas is updated, the amount of rows did double. But there's an extra column here that Spotfire added. I'll explain what this is just after adding my third data set. So again, I'm gonna add rows, browse for my emissions from the gaseous consumption. I know I need to change my first row, in this case, to a name row. I'd like to check my settings for the merger here. And then, boom, the data canvas has updated. All 3 data sets are now in one larger data set. The amount of rows makes sense, and the columns haven't increased since the last edition. Now, if I go back to my data table and scroll all the way to the right, I see that the column that Spotfire added is this origin of data column. Now, this tells me where my data came from solid, liquid, and gaseous consumption. So now I know where I got my data from originally. There's one more thing that I would like to show you, what I want to do to the data, and that is to change it from this wide format to a tall format. The wide format is more human readable, and the tall format analytics software such as Spotfire prefer. And I can do this really easy in Spotfire. All I need to do is select the columns that I want to unpivot, and there I go. I'm ready for the next steps. I want to thank you, and with that, I hand it back over to Bob.
Great, Andrew. Thank you. Appreciate that. And just to recap what Andrew did, he brought in multiple data sets. And the source of that data is interesting and clearly something that would be good for people wanting to learn more about Spotfire. It's from a website called the World Bank, and specifically the World Bank Indicators. And it's a wonderful site because it has about 300 different data files, but all the files are consistent in the same format. So in this case, we looked at CO2 emissions, but we had them in different categories. We were able to easily add those. You could take CO2 emissions using Spotfire and then put that against, say, population data and see if there's a correlation between those two. So again, it's just a great site. Andrew's going to be using that, and Dennis will be using that. World Bank Indicators will get you right there from a Google search. I'm switching gears up just a little bit, and I'm going to show you the next piece of it. And my piece is around data preparation and data enrichment. And those are two separate things in the sense of preparing the data, and it is doing a little bit of what Andrew did. As much as we talk about the 4 different buckets, Andrew not only brought in the data into Spotfire, but he prepared it by pivoting the data and unpivoting the data and adding the rows and columns and those kinds of things. But in this case, on my screen, we have one data set, and it's the number of people who have arrived to the country of New Zealand on a monthly basis for the last 100 years. But you'll note that on the screen, we only have 2 columns of data. We have the date and we have the arrivals. Not a lot to work with. And sometimes you'll be given data that just has that. So what could you do with that kind of data? Well, if you jump into Spotfire, the only thing you really can do is do a time course, a line chart over the bottom where you're putting the date, and then the arrivals over on the horizontal, on the vertical axis. But that gives us a chart that really isn't very usable. You get a sense, you know that 100 years ago there wasn't as many people going there's now. Probably all those jagged lines are some seasonal component to it, and everybody's going to be able to jump right to the end and know things fell off with COVID and those kinds of things, but only marginally useful from that standpoint. If we look at the data closely, though, we see a nice little breadcrumb. Right there in the date is the character M, and that will serve as a line of demarcation, being able to split this out. So if we look at Spotfire and we say, oh, great, well, we could take this and very easily split that into a year column and a month column. That's a step in the right direction. So we've gone from 2 to 4 columns. And then when you do that, what could you do? Well, now things are looking a little bit better. You've taken out the seasonality and you have a nice smoother curve from that perspective. So that's pretty good. And then down in the bottom, you're looking at it from a month's perspective. And if this is people arriving to New Zealand, you have to think about it. Oh, their seasons are opposite from here, in the U.S. So it kind of makes sense that there's an uptick in November and December into January. So now the data is starting to make a little more sense. We do have a wide range of nearly 0 here, way up to 300,000 here. What if we just take a quick look and change the scale of this data and see what happens from that perspective? Well, let's throw it on the large scale just to explore the data. Well, with that one move of trying to look at data as logarithmic scales allow you to do, look at wide ranges of data, you see something jump out at you instantly. Not only do we know COVID over here, but if we look at the dips here in the dates, well, right there, that's going to track, and a pretty good guess is that has to do with the depression, the economic depression in the late 20s. And then clearly here has everything to do with World War II. So out of something that we weren't seeing anything, with just one change of the mouse and putting the log scale on, we're able to look at that data. So that's good. So that's a little bit of data preparation, and now we're okay. But what if we take that a little bit further and we want to go in and really do some full-on enrichment of the data? And it's sort of that, again, I always go back to that term alchemy. Let's make gold out of lead. Well, if you do that, then applying a number of different things that we'll talk about in the tips and tricks, you can see that you have a very, very rich interface, a rich dashboard here. Here you have a heat map. Here you have information laid out in decades, months by decades. Over here, you have labels that I put in myself, it made sense to me before the war, World War II, just immediately after the war, and then all the way into COVID from that perspective. But let's see how we're able to do just a little bit of analysis. So Spotfire is a very cool feature where any one of these charts or graphs can be exploded out with simply here, clicking that. And now let's look at what this analysis tells us. So if we look at the data, I was able to bin it or chunk it into 5 year groups. So every 20 years is one of the panels. So that's good. Then I took the months and instead of looking at 12 months, I looked at them seasonally. So now I'm looking at it spring, summer, fall, and winter. And each one of these panels represents the percentage within that 20-year period of the number of people who arrived. So if we look at the front and the back, so back in 1922, in those first 20 years, more people were arriving in the summer and less in the winter. And you can tell that by not only the height of the bars, but also the numbers here. And then here is the standard deviation of that one panel. Now let's fast forward over here to the current era, 2002 to 2021. You see a nice change. One is the variability over those 4 bars has decreased. And you can see that visually over all of those 5 years. And what you really take from this is now it is much more balanced. More people are going to New Zealand evenly, or not quite evenly, but more are going in the winter months than they were 100 years ago, which makes sense from a number of different reasons, air travel and just the mobility of the population right now. But maybe 20 years ago, there was a marketing campaign that said, hey, come to New Zealand in the winter. So anyway, the point of this section is that with the first 2 columns, you wouldn't be able to do this. With just a few little enrichment kinds of things, you're able to tease out some really, really interesting insights from that perspective. So that's a little bit about data preparation and a little bit about data enrichment. So now that we've gone through the first 2 sections, I'm going to hand it to my colleague, Dennis, and he's going to walk us through the data exploration and visualization, as well as the sharing and collaboration piece as well. Dennis, over to you.
Thank you, Bob. And in the next few minutes, I'd like to show you how to use Spotfire in order to explore and visualize your data. I'll be using as well as an example the World Bank's data on carbon dioxide emissions from 1990 to 2019 by country. And since this is a time series data, I have chosen to represent it using a line chart visualization, which is most of the times the best visualization type to explore time series data. And therefore, here, each line represents one country. Now, what we could see right away in our data is that there are a couple of countries that stand out because of having very large carbon dioxide emissions. These countries are, as you can see in the tooltips, China and the United States. But most of the countries remain grouped at the bottom of the visualization right here. So our goal is to uncover the differences between these countries and find some interesting insights that may have been hiding in what it seems like a little bit of a messy data. Now, what can we do in Spotfire to take a look at this bottom portion of the visual? Well, we could zoom into it. We could use Spotfire zoom slider and go ahead and explore that lower part of the visual. And we could right away see that indeed there are differences between the countries. Or we could as well explore country by country in an individual manner. So I could bring in Spotfire filters, and in the country name section, I could start picking individual countries to see their data. However, any of those 2 methods will take us to the other extreme, right, where we actually lose the capability of seeing the global picture and comparing the whole data and country to each other. So probably none of these methods are good to perform the task at hand. But what if we could, for example, group these countries based on a property, like, for example, the region of the world they're located in, And that's what I've done over here in this page. As you can see, I have grouped the countries based on the region of the world they're located in, and actually colored them by that property as well. So you can see at the top left, countries in East Asia and the Pacific, color blue, color from Europe and Central Asia, color red, countries from Middle East and Africa, color purple, and so on. I have also added individual scales to each of the panels. So at each group, countries are represented from the lowest to the highest values of carbon dioxide emissions within that group. And performing this simple task, I think Spotfire actually goes a long way. So we have started now seeing a lot of differences between the countries within each group. So this adds a lot of clarity to the analysis. Now in Spotfire, we can always go one step further. So what if I could, for example, wish to explore the data of each of these groups individually and do that on demand? Well, that's what I have created this page for. As you can see at the top, we're still coloring the regions of the world using the same coloring scheme as before. But now I have chosen to use a bar chart that is going to serve as selectors. So the individual bars are going to serve as selectors. And whenever I click on any of them, I'm marking that data and automatically drilling down into the details of the data. So I am selecting each of the regions from the top and drilling down into the details of the carbon dioxide emissions of the countries in that region at the bottom. And certainly drilling down is one of Spotfire's strengths, but we can, of course, combine it and mix it with other powerful capabilities of Spotfire, like, for example, the interactivity between visuals. So I have created another page where I have added an extra line chart, as you can see in the right-hand side, to, in this case, show the carbon dioxide emissions as the difference in percentage year over year. So now we're, besides drilling down into the data, we're actually seeing at that data from multiple angles. We could see in absolute values the carbon dioxide emissions over time, but also comparing every year with the previous one per country. And that serves us to find interesting insights. So take a look at these spikes over here. So we're finding countries that have reported huge spikes in carbon dioxide emissions comparing to the previous year. And I could focus on these interesting countries. For example, this one is Haiti. So I could select this country, and if I want to isolate it and explore it individually, I could filter my data just to see that country in detail. Now, we have indeed made a lot of progress while exploring our data and visualizing it. But as data scientists, we may have missed interesting insights. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to let Spotfire find those insights for me in case I have missed any of them. And in order to do so, I'm going to be using one of Spotfire's built-in analytics in the area of machine learning. And I'm going to do so. I'm going to bring back my filters, reset them just to bring all my data back. And I'm going to rebuild my initial line chart. So now all I have to tell Spotfire is which columns I would like to represent from my data in each of the axes. So I would like to have years in the categorical axis. Spotfire has already chosen to represent the values of carbon dioxide emissions in the value axis, so that's great. But as you can see, all the data is aggregated. So the last thing I have to do is just tell Spotfire that I would like to see each country represented by an individual line. Okay, so that's great. I have my initial line chart created now. So I would like to let Spotfire create the groups for me. I'd like to let Spotfire find and group countries based on similarity in the patterns of carbon dioxide emissions over the years. But I want to be able to tell Spotfire the number of groups or clusters I would like to create. So in order to do so, I would like to run a k-means clustering. However, note that in Spotfire you have access to many other different analytics and algorithms you could use, like light similarity, hierarchical clustering, regression modeling, and many others. But for now, let's go ahead and run a k-means clustering. Now, I would like to create, say, 8 groups. And since I know that the groups or clusters numbering starts at 0, I'm going to type 7 in this box, click OK, Now I have my groups created for me. Before proceeding, I'd like to perform a few cosmetic changes. First of all, I'd like to see the years in the categorical axis. So I'd like to turn them to be shown vertically, so I could see the whole number. I would like also to add individual scales to each of the clusters, or each of the panels. And I would like to as well highlight the differences visually by coloring each of the clusters based on their numbers. So if I scroll down in the Spotfire filters, I could see there's a new column created as a result of the analysis, showing the number of the clusters each country was assigned to. So all I have to do is just left click, drag and drop this column into my visualization and choose to color it by that color. So great. Now we could right away see at least one pattern we have seen earlier, meaning we have clusters in which there's one or two countries that stand out from the rest that remain grouped at the bottom. So that happens in cluster number 4, cluster number 6, cluster number 7, number 2 as well. However, cluster number 5 is interesting because seemingly these countries were grouped together because they have at least in common this huge spike over here. So I would like to continue to dig deeper into this individual cluster. And I'm going to use Spotfire filters to choose that cluster only. I'm going to choose cluster number 5. And now you could see right away that these countries were grouped together because they reported a huge spike in carbon dioxide emissions in the year 2009. Well, this is actually great. We've definitely missed that before. I would like to therefore continue digging deeper into these countries. And I can use Spotfire filters for that because besides being meant overall to help you focus on individual snapshots of your data, the Spotfire filters are also very informative. So if I scroll over the Spotfire filters, I could see that all of these countries are from Latin America and the Caribbean region. So these countries are geographically close together. And I could also see their names, so Antigua and Barbuda, Bahamas, Barbados, Belize, indeed countries from the Latin America and the Caribbean. Now, what happened was that Spotfire, by means of one of its machine learning built-in algorithms, found for me that countries that are geographically close together reported a huge spike in carbon dioxide emissions in the year 2009. That is amazing. Now, I'd like to spend the next couple of minutes just showing you how to share your insights and your results. For example, my colleague Andrew will be, I know, really interested in having these insights. And I'd like also to show you how to collaborate while you explore and visualize your data. Now, first of all, I'd like to share this visualization as an image file. So I can go ahead in Spotfire and export it to a JPG or PNG file, also to a PDF file. I could export the underlying data as well, or choose to export the whole analysis file to a library, or to a PDF file, or a Microsoft PowerPoint presentation. Let's take a look at this option, for example. In Spotfire, when you export to a PowerPoint presentation, you have multiple options. You can export the active page, or the active visualization, or the whole analysis file, or any combination of those. So you have multiple options there, and it's really useful and really cool. I might be interested as well in being able to come back to this insight, no matter where I am in the world of exploring my data. So, as in any web browser of your web browser of choice, you can create bookmarks. In Spotfire, you can create bookmarks as well. So all you have to do is just go to the bookmarks panel, give the bookmark a name. I'm going to call it Spike, and just create it. Now, I would like to test if my bookmark will bring me always to this page, this visualization, this specific insight. So I'm going to filter, to set my filters to bring all my data. I'm going to change the page. And I'm going to click on my bookmark. So here I am, back into my very interesting finding. So that's great. Now, while creating your dashboard, while exploring your data, You can collaborate, you can leave messages to your colleagues, for example. You can use the collaboration panel to create and leave a comment for any of your colleagues. But you can also add annotation. So I could add annotation, especially in this case, that would be something like what happens here, because certainly this finding is really interesting to me. So I'd like to continue digging deeper into what happened in Latin America and the Caribbean in 2009, in carbon dioxide emissions. So I could place this annotation over here to remind me or any of my colleagues that this is a really good, interesting insight that needs to be researched a little bit further about. And well, this is a good example of how you can use Spotfire to explore your data, collaborate, and I have used the World Bank's carbon dioxide emission data, but this could be any data from very much any area of human activity, like cells growing in a reactor or any other data set you might have been working with. So, Bob, back to you now.
Great, Danis. Thank you very much. Excellent. So what was spent the last, say, 35 minutes or so going through the four elements, the four key aspects of Spotfire: the data access, data preparation, exploration and visualization, and then the sharing and collaboration. And there is a common theme between the two different data sets that we used, the World Bank data and then the New Zealand data. And that's in that we added new information, and based on adding that information, that data, it allowed us to have a richer data set and find those insights. So out of the gate, the World Bank data doesn't have that region information in. But one of the very first things Andrew did is he appended some columns to the right side of the data, and included in that was the region. So each country fits into a region of the world. Then when Danis came along and he started looking at the data and he found common things, he was able to find those common things by viewing the data in the trellis panel over the 6 different regions of the world. So without that, he might have got to those insights, but then he flipped it on its head and he let Spotfire and the machine learning algorithms go and do that. And then he saw the spikes, but then he correlated the spikes to his own study and adding in the regions. And then the same way with my data. I went through and I added these different columns, and then I got to the insights where things had changed somewhat dramatically over the last 100 years. So that's the second piece, and I emphasize that because in a lot of the Spotfire literature, they focus on a lot of different things, but there's an area that I think requires a lot of focus because it really adds things. Then the data exploration and visualization piece that Danis just went through, it's very easy. You can play, you can look at it this way, you can look at that way. You don't always have to have all the visualizations planned out for you. You can go find the insights and let the data talk to you. And then the last piece is sharing and collaboration. And as much fun as we all have with Spotfire, unless we take these insights and share them with our colleagues, that's not as effective, as efficient. So wanted to take just a few minutes and sort of summarize what we've seen. And now we want to transition to just ever so briefly a few tips and tricks. And for that, I want to show you a few of the things that I did in my section, a bit of how to do all of that. So one of the very first things that I did is I looked at the date field and then I split that into 2. Well, I didn't have to do a lot of work on that in the sense of I let Spotfire do it for me. So I go over to my data panel and then I look at that and I select my date. Well, there's a richness of information here. That tells me I have 1,200 unique values. So that's really good because I have 1,200 rows of data. It tells me that it's a string, so that makes sense. But now if I want to split that into 2 different columns, or 1 or 2 or 3, I just have a little wizard here. So I happen to know that it's an M, so I want to use that as my delimiter. But in this case, now I want to just move it to 2 columns. So right out of the gate, I get instant feedback and I say, all right, well, that's exactly what I want to do. I want to split it into the year and into the month. So that was quite easy from that perspective. Now, you'll notice I don't have it showed on the screen visually, but here we have a binned year kind of thing. Well, how did I do that? Well, in this case, I was lucky. I had 100 years, and I chose to bin it by 5 different chunks. But here you have a whole binning wizard, and that allows you to select based on a number of different things. You can bin any column you want, but you can bin it based on limits. You can just take 5 even buckets like I did. Or if you want to do it, if it's a mathematical field, you can bin it based on standard deviation. So there's a lot of easy ways to chunk up the data from that perspective. And then the one way that is a bit manual but incredibly powerful is I have the 12 months of the year laid out here in the top right-hand side. Now, how did I get those months into the different seasons? Well, that's quite easy. I could have done it a couple of different ways, but one way to do it is simply select those values, go over here, do a right mouse click, and then put it in the group from marked. So part of a key function of Spotfire is marking the data. So I chose to mark, months 2, 3, and 4. And now I'll choose to group them from the mark. And I can just go put that here. And in this case, I can use the season of fall. And now it's going to modify the visualization, and it puts those 3 months in the fall. Then I can grab these 3, and then again, the same operation, put them in the winter, and so on and so forth. So after 2 more operations, I will have now my seasons of the year, and I can use that as well. So there's a case where rather than let the computer do it, I did it myself. I went through and I chose, and I could decide what I wanted to do from that perspective. So those are 3 examples of changing the data or enriching the data so that I can visualize it as a data field. But I'll draw your attention to the bottom as well. I'll bring that up here. Now, in this case, I chose to create a column, and I called it 0 or 5. I'm dealing with the year, and if it ends in a 0 or 5, I flagged it as a yes or a no. So now, instead of doing analytics on it, I use it as a visual cue, and I can color the data. So it makes it more visually appealing from that perspective. So in that case, not only can I color by that, but 100 years of data, that's a lot. No one cares about 1927 versus 1928 necessarily. But in this case, I can just say, okay, show me just the 0s or 5s. So now I've used my filter panel to zoom in, and now this data is a little bit more meaningful. Still gives me the trend over the 100 years, but now they're more discrete. Or in this case, I have another field where it's similar to the 0 or 5, but it's the start of the decade. So maybe, again, I want to go back to a visual kind of feel. I just go over here, and I could select that and color by start of the decade. So now I have the best of both worlds. I'm looking at every 5 years, but I have an alternating color pattern as well. So the idea is when you create these fields, you create them for analytics, you create them for visual effect, a number of different things. So all in, I won't have time to go through every field, but I went from 2 to about 14 different fields that I use when I analyze this data. So hopefully there's a couple of tips and tricks there that somebody that's used Spotfire might take away and start to use tomorrow, or it's what the appetite of some folks who look at it and say, wow, that's pretty easy to do. So that's it for the tips and tricks. I'm going to pass it back to Chris to kind of land the plane here and take us out. Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Bob. And we will share out the recording in a couple of days, so watch your inboxes for it. This concludes our session for today. Have a great day.